Ciao a tutti, benvenuti. Welcome to today's installment of my interviews with interesting folks that I've met through Batasiolo and Giowine. Today I'll be talking with Sara Cardullo, and I'm going to bring her in right now. She's already ready to go. So hope we all have, looking forward to a very enjoyable discussion about language and wine and how they interrelate, especially today and since the 1800s in this case. So here we're going to add Sara right now. Ciao Sara, mi senti? Oh, non c'è il volume dal mio lato. Vediamo cosa è successo. Tu mi senti?
Sì.
Oh, there you go.
Ok.
Benvenuta, come stai?
Bene, grazie. Doing well. How are you?
Doing great, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today for this interview. I appreciate your time. I know you're super busy, so thanks for taking the time to do an interview.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really, really grateful.
Excellent. So I'm going to do my best to do an introduction for you. I also have a professional introduction that you sent me, but I will probably stumble over some of the words, so I may defer to you for that part of the introduction. But as far as me introducing you, we work for the same family company, Giovanni Cardullo Inc. For those of you out there, you can probably guess which one of us is more related to the family company than the other. So I've been working with the company for 15 years, and I knew you before then. But our families got together not super frequently, so I got to know you more once I started joining the company. And back then, you were already interested in language and wine, being in a wine household and a multilingual household. And my guess is you were probably attracted to languages first before the distinguishment to linguistics.
Yes, I would say so.
Excellent. And you took that interest in languages and then linguistics, and now you're a graduate student researcher at the University of Cambridge, working on your doctoral program. And is it okay if we mention where you are in the world right now?
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm in the Eolian Islands off the coast of Sicily. It's a volcanic archipelago, I don't know how you say it in English, off the coast of Sicily. There are 7 islands, and I'm currently on the island of Salina, which is one of the bigger of the two. I don't think we can see it here, but it's one of the more central islands, Salina.
Let me switch apps, so it should show up on the screen there. Yep. So we're going to see what kind of resolution we can get out of this. Probably not at the highest level since I haven't purchased this map, but that's a beautiful map that you have here. So it's going to be this area right here, this volcanic
so it's like third from the bottom, and it's pretty central. Yeah, so where your mouse is kind of right now. Yeah.
And you've actually studied in all of these islands. You're just here right now.
Yes.
Excellent. So I'll refer back to this map in a second. Thank you for sending this to me. That's a phenomenal map that you sent me. It's very interesting to look at. And so you are currently working, you've done your master's or your magistrale equivalent at when you were at the University of Pisa on the Eolian Islands, and I'll let you get into the particulars of what you exactly did, because I actually have your fantastic Daisy, which I have to admit I haven't finished reading it yet. It's a lovely read, but it's definitely helpful if you're in the field to know all the terminology. But it's a really fascinating read, especially because I think it applies a lot. There's a lot of things of interest to us in the international wine business, and that love to languages as well and linguistics as well. So thank you to your folks. I had to sign something in blood that nothing would happen to this because one of 2 copies in the Western Hemisphere that I know of.
Yeah, I think my mom would, behead you or something.
Yes. I got a long list of things that would happen to me if anything happened to this. So I'm treating it very carefully. The kids are not allowed to touch it, as you can imagine. Yeah. So yes, let me know what am I missing from the introduction here? You sent me a professional bio that if you want to go into a little bit of detail of what you're studying and how you're going about it right now.
Yeah, I mean, it was just to kind of give you a more general idea. But basically, I study Romance linguistics, comparative Romance linguistics at the University of Cambridge, and I'm doing my PhD in the Italian department. But I'm really looking at Italian linguistics and specifically Italian dialects. So Romance languages are the languages that derive from Latin, and Italian dialects, like those languages that we traditionally consider to be Romance languages, like French, Portuguese, Spanish, Romanian, Italian, are also Romance languages. So we can consider Italian dialects to be sister languages to all the languages I just mentioned. So that was just to give a general background.
Not to take away from the seriousness of what you're studying, but just for a moment of levity, how many languages would you say you speak?
5.
And how many languages would you say your father speaks? Because he's multilingual as well.
I would say 5 as well.
It's a very political answer. That's a very nice explanation.
It is a political answer, absolutely.
No, he also knows a phenomenal number of languages, and one of the first memories I have of you is actually the furthest I got in language instruction for Italian was probably the middle school level. And when I first met you, you grew up knowing English, Spanish, and Italian, but I think maybe at the beginning my Italian was slightly better than yours. And now the level of Italian you've achieved in something like this is incredibly remarkable. And your familiarity with languages, just as far as languages are concerned, is quite thorough in your study of linguistics and languages. So my hat is off to you. Phenomenal work there. The level of Italian.
I definitely had some help with the editing process. It was not easy, and definitely grew a lot in my use of academic, formal, and written Italian. But what I own was, also I had a lot of help.
Well, I mean, if just one thing is one of the body of research that you referred to on here was actually written in German, if I'm not mistaken, by a Swiss researcher.
Yes, exactly.
Was that even available in Italian or English, or did you have to read it in German?
Well, I didn't actually get so much into the original text. There was an Italian translation which was never published, unfortunately, and I'm trying to get my hands on that. But most of my contact with that text was through the subsequent study, which made reference to it and which collected novel data and compared it with the methods and the issues of that prior study. Also, because my study was on a completely different aspect of the dialect as compared to the German study. I did take an academic German study course, which, especially during the lockdown, with the time difference, it ended up being at like 6 or 7 a.m., which was just extremely brutal. And
the language or the time?
Sorry?
The time zone or the language itself, which was the brutal part?
Well, German at 6 a.m. is kind of illegal.
It should be. If it isn't, it should be. I agree.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do have some German text, at least one specific one that I really do need to translate. But that whole work I wasn't able to read. It was a whole doctoral thesis and on an aspect of the language different from the one I studied. So
very cool. Very cool. So I was thinking back when I was preparing for this interview, and one of the first memories that I have that relates to you was when I was visiting Batasiolo for the first time, which is, it's one of what I focus on. I was amazed. I'd always been interested in the fact of different dialects in Italian beyond just the variations in language. And it was amazing to me to go in the vineyards in Batasiolo and Barolo in Piemonte, and to find out that, the resident Som that lived 40 minutes away had extreme difficulty sometimes when folks in the vineyards would talk amongst themselves, being able to understand what they were saying because of the relationship of how different the dialects were. And so when you then got interested into language at a much deeper level, I can't remember if I ever brought that up or not before, but that was one of the things I was thinking about when you mentioned that you were really getting interested in linguistics and Italian as a language. I don't know if had I ever mentioned that to you before.
No, you hadn't.
Okay.
That makes me think a lot about my first, I guess the first time I went to Vinitari, when my dad dragged me there when I was 15, and also subsequent trips, which I think is kind of exemplary of what you're saying, even though different, because in these settings you have all of these different stands, and since we work with suppliers from many different regions, we have to go into the different halls associated with the different regions, and then go to their respective stands. And so in each stand, not only do you have the different producer, the different wine, but you also have the different accent, extremely, very different accents. So within a couple hours, you can kind of sample many different aspects of Italian accents, sorry. So something really important to talk about here would be that when we're talking about, a village in Piedmont and winemakers, a lot of times here we're talking specifically about the dialect that is spoken. So a separate language as compared to Italian. And what happens is over time, Italian, I guess I'm getting into a tangent here, but it's very interesting. So until the 70s, we have most people speaking dialect as a language and not Italian. Actually, more people spoke dialect than Italian until the 70s. And so what happens is Italian starts becoming more widely spoken throughout, I guess, like military drafts and then through TV and radio. But the Italian that's learned by the Italians takes on different accents, different shapes, different constructions, syntactic constructions based on the dialect that is spoken in that area. And so we would call these resulting codes, linguistic codes. We wouldn't, in linguistics, we don't actually call this Italian, a unified Italian. We wouldn't call this standard Italian. We actually call this regional Italian. So we have many different regional Italians, which we can even consider to be different varieties as compared to standard Italian and as compared to the dialect, which we would call a kind of substrate language. It's the language that pre-exists, that's kind of like the baseline through which Italian is learned and through which Italian takes on different shapes. And so when I'm going through the different stands in Vinitaly, I'm hearing different regional Italians. Whereas in Piedmont, you will actually probably have people speaking the dialect itself, which we would, consider a completely different linguistic code from Italian and regional Italian.
No, I think that's a really good distinction, and you can literally spend your whole life studying just that. So, very cool. Yeah, it's always something that you probably notice, even if you're American going to Vinitaly, the way things sound differently. But the reasoning behind and how the difference between what it sounds like to the way they're structured when you go to the different parts of Italy is because everybody's trying to speak Italian, right? When they go to Vinitaly, they're not speaking their dialect because then no one would understand this different language. But this cohesive substrate of language, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, do you want? Let's talk a little bit about what you're studying currently, which is expounding upon and going beyond what you did for your magistrale, for your thesis, for your master's.
So to talk about what I did for my master's?
What you're doing currently.
Okay. So right now, so basically my whole PhD project is kind of continuation of the work I did in my master's thesis. Basically, I expanded it and am considering, what I'm doing is I'm examining different, some key syntactic phenomena, so grammatical phenomena in the dialect of the Aeolian Islands. So, and then what I'm doing is I'm comparing that to what we find in other kinds of Southern Italian dialects, on which actually there has been a lot written about. Really, the field of Italian dialectology is extremely vast. Right. So actually, this map, really quickly, just to mention this would be the Carta dei dialetti italiani, dei dialetti d'Italia, sorry, published by Pellegrini in 1977. This is basically the classification of Italian dialects that we take as our starting point in Italian linguistics nowadays. So the different colors represent different subgroups. So yeah, anyway.
Sorry, I lost it. I'll get it back.
So, well, what we can say about Italian dialects is that we can separate them into three major groups. So the Northern Italian dialects, the Central, mainly Tuscan, right? So the yellow, and then the Tuscan would be the green. And then we would, the third major group would be the Central Southern Italian dialect group. And within these three major categories, we subdivide them further. So I'm looking mainly at Central Southern Italian dialects and really mainly at Southern Italian dialects. So comparing the purple dialects, so the extreme Southern Italian dialects, to the darker pink, the upper Southern Italian dialects. And so I'm studying the dialects spoken in this group of 7 islands that Stefano was pointing out, and to see how they behave. And you might ask, well, why are they categorized so differently? Well, we categorize Italian dialects in the same way that we categorize Romance languages, based on their linguistic behavior. And so specifically, this has to do mainly with phonetic and phonological criteria, so how sounds have evolved from Latin. You can categorize languages based on many different criteria, but this is kind of how these have been categorized, and which it reflects how the study of Romance languages has kind of evolved since the 1800s. So anyway, these major groups behave in different ways, and significantly different ways, which is why this is interesting. So I'm looking at key syntactic phenomena, which we can go more into detail and see how that compares as compared to the darker pink dialects and the purple dialects, the upper Southern Italian dialects and the extreme Southern Italian dialects. So what does that mean? I'm here, I basically spent a month doing field work, going to all of the different islands, collecting data to see, with my first goal being to document how these dialects behave as compared to each other, and then as compared to other dialects, but to see, based on those key phenomena that I'm studying, how they behave. So I had a questionnaire, and then I went asking for translations, because questionnaires are definitely a valid way to collect the specific data that I'm looking at. But then I also supplemented this with conversation, just hearing how people speak in general, because I've been able to stay longer than I had expected, which is really nice. So I went to all the different islands, and actually what has emerged, I still have a lot of work to do, but what has emerged is that from a grammatical point of view, at least in terms of the 3 or 4 major phenomena that I studied, all the islands really behaved in a very homogeneous way. So we could actually call this a unified, it has been called before, before myself right now, it has been called a single dialect, but, it's pretty remarkable that they would behave all similarly when we consider the extremely high degree of variation that we find, in mainland Italy, or, just from one town to the next. And especially when we consider that people from these towns, people from these islands, especially, I interviewed older people. I always interviewed older people that hadn't lived abroad, so to try to find the, original dialect. But those kinds of people do not travel to the...
If I can interrupt you for a second, that was actually one of the things I noticed. The age of most of the folks that you interviewed were pensionati, so in their 80s, and then a couple people in their 50s. Was that mostly because the younger populations were more focused on Italian versus their dialect, or because there was less chance of exposure to other languages for the younger cohort?
Wait, so you're asking why I would look for older people?
So yeah, the majority of your interviewees and the questionnaire responders were a bit older. Was that specifically done because there was less chance that they'd be exposed to other languages and traveling, or just to have a more pure version of the different dialect?
Well, I guess this would be kind of one of the main tenets of this kind of methodology, which has been criticized in sociolinguistics also, because a lot of the researches tend to be based on, fewer speakers as compared to, gathering mass amounts of data. And of course, an interesting thing to do here would be to interview different generations and then do a further comparison. That would be extremely interesting. But as a first, initial point, the important thing is to start documenting what you have, right? Also because we can separate linguistic variation into different axes. So you have diatopic variation, geographic variation, diastratic variation in terms of social class, diaphasic variation in terms of register that is used. They even call digenerational variation, so in terms of the generation that speaks the language. Diamesic, we have different kinds of axes along which you can study the linguistic variation. So I'm looking specifically right now at diatopic variation. And within this methodology, generally, older speakers are preferred because once you have speakers that have multiple linguistic codes in their mind, you can have a lot of, I wouldn't call it interference, but you have many different codes that you're managing. And so that can definitely influence the way you speak that code, right? The way you speak that dialect. And so once if you have a speaker that is a monolingual dialect speaker, you have a lot of wealth in these kinds of studies. That's kind of like the ideal situation, but one which you'll see much less and less over time. So younger speaker, even now it's hard to find an older speaker that's 60 to 80. It's even harder to get there, and people that haven't lived abroad, because lived abroad in the sense if they lived in Messina, so just the nearest coastal town to the Aeolian Islands, they will have been exposed to the dialect spoken there, which will in turn inevitably influence the way they speak their own dialect, or not necessarily speak their own dialect, but which opens up the range of possibilities that they're open to. So if I'm asking if you can say something in a certain way, if this is acceptable, they'll say yes. If they're even if I mention some kind of variety that's spoken in a different area that they've lived in. So you the idea is to try to find the pure dialect spoken in that area, even though that's a very artificial term.
Right. But being on islands, they're fairly isolated, so there's a better chance that you can have a specific population of speakers.
Yes. Yes. No. That's for sure. And actually, you bring up a really interesting point because so you have in the 60s, you have a study published on. So you basically have the areal or spatial norms of linguistic variation of Matteo Bartoli, who basically distinguished 4 norms according to which you tend to know which variant is the more conservative or older or closer to Latin variant. So you have the peripheral area, so the area. So if you have 2 different a variant, maybe a way in which a word is pronounced, the area that is, if you really look at the map and the distribution of this kind of variant, the variant that is spoken in the more peripheral area is said to be the more conservative one. And you'll have the norm of the isolated area. So the isolated area is said to be, the variant that you find in the isolated area is said to be the one that is more conservative. Okay, these are tendencies, of course. You have different areal norms as well, but those are 2 of them. Those are tendencies, and also it really depends on where the variation starts, right? Where the change starts, where the change propagates from, okay? If it reaches that isolated area or not. What really is an isolated area or not? Can we consider these isolated areas? That's an interesting question. I see that Kenneth Friedman here had a question. I don't know, I can really, really briefly just mention something on this, because this is also really important. So he's talking about.
I'll put the question on the screen so everybody can see.
Oh yeah, okay. So he's making reference to the languages spoken before or during Latin across the Italian peninsula. So we would consider these specifically substrate and adstrate languages. And this kind of comment that he makes would make reference to what we call the substrate the substrate theory of language. So if those variations in the dialects are due to the languages that were spoken on the territory before Latin was spread to those areas. So if we think about when Latin begins to be spoken, so 4 centuries before, like the year 0, 5 centuries before the year 0. But before that, we have different languages spoken, and during that time, we also have Greek and Arabic. We have a lot of groups of people migrating and inhabiting those territories. So that was actually theory. Those were theories that were extremely popular, especially at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. Now there's been a lot less emphasis placed on them, but I mean, yes, that they are theories that have definitely been explored. Definitely, absolutely.
So very basically, my guess is that with the expansion of the Roman Empire, Latin became more of the lingua franca of the kingdom and was exported or migrated along with the expansion of the Roman Empire, and so therefore the progenitors weren't as alive in the language sphere. Would that be a terrible way to explain it?
You skipped a second for me. I think my internet went out. So can you repeat that?
Okay. No, it's okay. I was just trying to think it up in my head because my level of studies of linguistics is not to the level maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I just didn't hear everything you said, but basically, if we would just consider, the language. I mean, the languages that were spoken before Latin and how they influenced the way Latin was spoken and the way Latin changed into the Romance languages. So, kind of as a parallel to what I said earlier about regional Italian and dialect as a substrate.
So that actually, and we should say hi to Francesco too, who says a huge hello. So that actually gets me to another question that I had. So in my mind, one of the things that makes the study of linguistics and the study of wine fairly parallel is that we talk about the evolution and the propagation of genetics of grapes and varieties of grape, and you can see in that history that is so alive. And to me, the way I understand language, and please correct me, is that it's kind of the same way, where you see an evolution of language as it moves through history. It's not this static text, but it's this way of communicating, this social way of communicating that is influenced by so many things and is fully alive and changing all the time. How far off am I in making that point?
I really liked your analogy, and I was thinking about it, and I was trying to take it a step further in the sense that
if there's anybody that can, it'd be you.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about like the grapes themselves, well, grape variety as a kind of abstract entity. We know this is, I don't know, Cabernet Sauvignon or whatever, and so like we know this is Italian, but then we have the actual grapes, and then we have the wine itself that's produced from the grapes. And so I was thinking of grapes as speakers that are emerge from different terroirs and really change over time. And then the must as the language, the must as produced from the grapes as language is produced from speakers. And then like the different kinds of production of wine as aging or any kind of differences in production would be kind of the different kinds of variation that we find in language at a given time. I don't know. This is just me taking the analogy further. But yes, at the same time, we find, in linguistics, we talk about synchronic linguistics and diachronic linguistics. Hola, Osvaldo. And so diachronic linguistics would be the study of language over time and how it changes. And then synchronic linguistics would be, at a given time span, what does that linguistic system look like? What kind of variations do we find within a linguistic system at a given time? And so, like we find language changing over time and wine, I guess, the grape variety propagating itself over time. We also find a lot of, especially in Italy, biodiversity, a lot of different diversity in grape varieties, which is especially what we find in Italian languages. So in Italian dialects, we find at a given time, like at this given moment, we have many different kinds of grape varieties and we have many different kinds of Italian dialects. So we have a lot of variation in synchrony and in diachrony, both with
and just to remind folks that hadn't caught the beginning of this, that there's a distinct difference between accents and dialects, whereas the way something sounds and the way they're structurally different. Would that be a good way to explain it? As unique languages.
Yeah, I mean, again, when I talk about accents, I'm making reference to Italian, regional Italian, but regional Italian is not just a difference in accents. Okay. I did say that in the sense that that's kind of what was immediately noticeable to me. But yes, I mean, in the sense that we have difference in dialects, regional Italian and Italian, but we can even consider regional Italian, depending on how much it varies, between the different kinds of regional Italians and between standard Italian and dialect, may also differ structurally in the sense that there may be different kinds of constructions that are used. So we really can talk about them as different kinds of varieties, like an intermediate almost. I mean, yeah.
And also, I made a note of this. I didn't want to forget, but I thought one of the fun things was that one of the people that you interviewed was actually a viticoltore. That was her profession, if I understood that correctly. So that tie together between languages and when I was looking for talking points, I thought that was kind of fun that there was one of the people you interviewed. Yeah. I refer to page.
Yes, please.
See if I can find it quickly. I tried to put book notes, but there was a young lady in her 80s that I might have to put this up later in case I can't find it right away, so we don't have dead air time. But was, I'll find it later. That way we're not. Oh, here we are. The one from not from Lipari. There was one. I'm looking at it right here. I know I can find it quickly.
I can't remember off the top of my head.
I was only because I was just reading it. Oh, here we go. The one from Santa Marina. She was a wine production and restaurateur. From that's the only phrase that it had on it. So I don't know if that.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Yes. Now I remember exactly who it was. Yes.
So I actually have no recollection of what grapes are more typically found in the Isole Olie versus, say, northern Sicily. I don't know if there's some Moscato there as well, like in the completely other side of the islands of Sicily. But
yeah, you have a lot of like Nerello Mascalese.
Oh, like that.
And then you also have like Malvasia, of course, produced here. But I mean, I think the main islands that produce are like Salina. I mean, really, the Eolian Islands used to be a major producer of wine, and they used to. But then they were really affected by gosh, I really have to pronounce in English certain things. So the Phylloxera, the Phylloxera outbreak, basically.
Oh yeah. Were you going to say in Italian or Aeolian? Which were you gravitating towards?
Italian. And so basically, you have a lot of people emigrated, especially like. It's said that a lot of people emigrated because of that reason, because a lot of people worked in wine, including and also in fishing, but a lot of people were affected by what happened in the wine trade. And so there was a massive emigration from the Eolian Islands in the 1900s, early 1900s, mid 1900s, to the US, South America, but especially Australia. So everyone in the Eolian Islands some cousin or someone, some relation in Australia.
That's really interesting. Any
There are
particular part of
probably, I
Australia?
think there are more Aeolians in Australia or descendants of Aeolians in Australia than there are in the Aeolian Islands.
Is there like a specific part of Australia where there's like a community of Aeolian diaspora?
No, there's definitely a cohesive community. I think mainly in Sydney and Melbourne, but I can't remember right now.
Interesting. So is your next trip going to be to Sydney and Melbourne to interview some folks there?
Well, actually, that would be the logical continuation of my project, would take me there. And actually, going back to the spatial and areal norms that I talked about earlier, they basically, one of the four norms was also the norm of the area seriore, so the serially subsequent island or subsequent variant. So in the sense that when you have a what's the word, diaspora, right? So so you have a community that moves abroad, and then we have that code, the linguistic code spoken by those speakers is also exported abroad. And then at that point, it's kind of like you have like some kind of biological linguistic evolution that continues in parallel. So that same code will then evolve in different ways. And a lot of times it's said that that exported code, the code spoken in the diaspora, is actually more conservative from certain points of view. So it actually would be really interesting for me to go there to see what kinds of linguistic behavior I find.
Yeah, because it's more insulated from affectations from other Italian languages and dialects. So it's kind of like when you were doing your recordings here in San Diego of some of the different families that spoke Sicilian dialects, Messinese or whatever, coming over here, and how their version of the dialects has been kept alive in the family and the larger family community compared to. That's kind of cool. Awesome. Yeah. So to step back a moment, a little bit to a more accessible form of language studies and wine. So just to very simplistically maybe talk about this, one of the things that is talked about, and whether it's true or not is definitely, you could probably give us a better barometer. But when us as a company working with Italian families and French families in different parts of the Americas, I find that sometimes when I speak about wine in different languages, I reach for different adjectives. I think about it slightly differently. Is there, in your experience, I mean, you actually did a stage in Bordeaux, so that's why you're our French ambassador. You've spent time in different parts of the Americas speaking Italian, Spanish, and English. Do you find that you speak in different ways about wine, depending on the language you speak in? And is there anything beyond that, more than just a window dressing?
Well, I was thinking about this, and actually, I think like in other aspects of speech, I mean, in my personal view of language, because then again, we can also talk about how this would be studied from an academic perspective. We could talk about cognitive linguistics, we could talk about the theory of linguistic relativity, but this is not my subfield of linguistics. And so I would tell you, like intuitively, in my view, I mean, I relate this kind of difference in approaching descriptions of wine to different ways of engaging in, engaging in different social contexts. I mean, I would link that to my different ways of speaking and living different languages. I think actually what struck me, it didn't really strike me, it was just something that I really had to pay attention to, was those key terms that you really have to know in all of the languages. Those terms like vintage, harvest, variety. Those may really differ between even Romance languages. And so those are, those always have to be kind of like your center stage when you are, conversing about wine in those languages. So, I mean, that's what I would say. I mean, it's also been a while since I've kind of engaged in this kind of talk about wine in all those different languages, but I would say that that's something that really stood out to me, especially when I, if I was in France and if there were some clients from Brazil, for example, and then I would, I'd have to make sure I knew how to say, vintage, I have to say safra, okay, cepa. I have to, those are the words that I really have to, know. And then the way I speak about the wine, like the way I speak about things in general, will necessarily vary because that's just the way I engage with the different languages.
Okay, so there's some anchor terms that you have to know in all the different languages that are very much standardized, but then possibly just because of the way you're engaging with somebody, because of the dialect and languages, there may be some slight fluctuation. So for you, it's not as important, maybe with emphasis, as like just making sure those key terminology to be able to communicate effectively. Or okay, cool.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's a really interesting question what you ask, if there are tendencies in the ways that wine is described. I think that's an extremely interesting question.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's tough for me because I only speak 2 languages fairly well, compared to like 5. So I speak a little bit of Spanish, but so I don't know if the way I talk about wines and Italian wines in Spanish is because of my lack of vocabulary, or if it's just I really am living it a little bit differently. So that's why I wanted to ask you about that. So thank you. So maybe in 20 years, if you shift field of study within linguistics, we'll be able to address that.
Yeah.
Let's see here. What other questions that I have? How are you doing on time? I know you're super busy, so I don't want to keep you too long.
No, I mean, the semester ended, so I'm a lot more free. It's just later because I'm in Italy, but I mean, yeah, depends.
Well, let's talk about that for a second before I review my other questions. So one of the other themes about these discussions is about the way we connect in these times of pandemic, and obviously the way we travel and where we're living and how we're living is a little bit different. So what has been a little bit different for you in this pandemic, trying to do your research, and obviously self-stranding yourself where you wanted to study anyways ended up being a good solution, but can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, well, I ended up taking actually, I would like to talk specifically about university structure in the sense that in the UK, at least the University of Cambridge, really affords different kinds of opportunities of pauses when this is necessary. And so I reflected on this with my supervisor, and while I continue to do different kinds of didactic work, I actually put my project on pause. Paused my PhD, and then was able to restart again when I did my fieldwork, because I was supposed to go on a fieldwork trip in March, which was canceled. And so then I was able to take it in August, September, and actually to extend it. That was unexpected, but it was totally appreciated. I'm extremely grateful to be able to stay here longer. I don't know if that would have been possible for me otherwise, because right now it's really hard to move around. Travel is risky, and so it was kind of like a choice for me in order to be closer to my project that I probably wouldn't have had otherwise. And also the fact that I was able to pause my project, one, I felt that was necessary. Since I only received funding for a given number of years, it was important for me to do this. And I also really appreciated the university's flexibility in this. It's studying in the US, studying at UC Berkeley, for example, University of California, it's not really the same kind of structure that you wouldn't really find this kind of option.
So graduate level,
I'm not sure.
Okay.
And I know you have some kinds of pauses, but it's really different. Yeah.
So what's the situation like in Salina and the Eolian Islands now? Are you able to continue your research now when you were doing your actively researching, or were there still some restrictions and mandates in place that made it a little bit difficult?
Well, I would say that, what really happened was that I had basically after my first month of moving around between the different islands, I spent 5 to 7, about 5 days in each island, in which I really tried to ask all my questions that I had, I was almost able to finish this in all of the islands, and that was an extremely intense period of data collection. And I was going to continue that, in the island that I'm on right now, so at Salina. But then the semester also started, so I was in parallel also doing assisted teaching, and so it was really hard for me to balance both of those things and process the data I had already collected, and then collect further data, which is what I need to do. In terms of norms, mandates, local mandates, it actually wouldn't have been too hard for me, in the sense that, people are generally more open to seeing you, interacting with you, even at a distance or not. So I might even have been able to travel to the different islands. That's not certain, but I might have been able to do that as well. So thankfully, because it would have been for work or study reasons, and that was one of the excuses, I guess, that one had to travel between the different islands.
Well, I think one of the interesting things. Oh yeah, Massimo says hello. Giovanni says hello. Of course, you probably know him. Well, yeah. To take up on one of the things you said earlier, is one of the things I found really interesting is that you actually saw quite a bit of homogeneity in the Aeolian dialect compared to a lot of island variation, I guess. So maybe this travel to island to island is not as necessary to continue your research. So that's a benefit, I guess.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean. I guess the most important thing there was to establish what kind of variation we find within the different islands. And as of now, I really have not found very much or nothing significant, which is, I find extremely amazing.
Yeah. So, very cool, especially since you're interviewing an older generation that
it really hasn't traveled much to the other islands. So
yeah. Very cool. Well, I want to let you go fairly soon. I have one piece of gotcha journalism for you, unless there's anything else that we haven't had a chance to share yet that you want to. I mean, obviously, you teach classes about this that are hours long, but if there's anything else that you feel like you want to impart now, feel free.
Okay.
If there's anything we've missed.
Well, I would say one thing, besides saying ciao to Mario and grazie Massimo, and of course. So basically, I would say that it's really important to note that the difference between dialect and language is a purely socio-political one. So we can consider them linguistic codes, linguistic varieties that are linguistically on par. So there are not really many significant differences on a linguistic level. So we can't really distinguish them besides, in terms of standardization and maybe amount of, lexicon that we have available to talk about within different semantic fields. But otherwise, if you look at at a dialect and a language, you can't, on linguistic criteria, determine which is a language and which is a dialect. The difference here, the way that language and dialect are distinguished, is because one is the official national language of a country. Okay, so this really has to do with the right of the nation states. So once you have the use of one linguistic code for a wide linguistic territory, everything else, every other linguistic code is demoted in a sense to dialect, is considered dialect. So you have one language and the other linguistic codes that are spoken in a linguistic territory are dialects. It's really important to note that monolingualism is not, contrary to what we would say now, is not the norm. This really has to do with the rise of nation states and the concept of nation state being tied to language. But otherwise, in the past, really, plurilingualism, and even in the present, plurilingualism is actually the norm. So it's not really amazing for someone to speak 2-3 languages. It's amazing to speak only one language. In the sense that, one language will also vary, and so we can consider those different linguistic varieties. But the point is that over time, the use of different linguistic codes has been more common than the use of one single linguistic code. So I really want to point that out. The prevalence of plurilingualism as opposed to monolingualism, and also that the difference between dialect and language is sociopolitical. It is not linguistic.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of two things. One, close to home, with the Philippines, you have a national language, but each island has its own language, in effect. And it's not like one is over the other. It's just there was a decision to unify and have one official language. And also, a lot of people don't realize that Italy is a very young country and it wasn't unified politically until 1861. And so there was a lot of different languages spoken at the same time. Is that accurate to say?
After the unification, the unification did not instantly create, an Italian that was spoken by, everyone.
Took radio and TV to help it along.
Yeah, and wars.
And wars, yeah, that's true. All right, thank you for. Yeah, so there's quite a few people that said hello, as you can tell. So in front of all these friends and family, and both, my mom and your dad, I have a piece of gotcha journalism for you, something that I actually had no idea about, and we actually had to look up at the office. So on your thesis, there is the professors that were reviewing your work and did the. I'd never seen this abbreviation before. CHIAR.MO. And I had no idea what it stood for. And so, of course, your dad was able to figure it out. But it took us a moment to actually figure out what it means. So if you could explain to everybody what that means.
Well, I mean, it should be like chiarissimo or something.
That is correct. That is correct.
It's a formality, right? And I think you have that and you have that in all fields. I mean, we have academics here from different areas of study in Italy. So, I mean, I've just seen through the comments Mario and Massimo, but I think you have this in theses, of different areas of study. So, I mean, it's a formality that's been, passed down, and you have a lot of aspects in Italy that are,
Because what does chiarissimo mean in Italian?
Sorry?
What does chiarissimo mean in English, if you were to translate it?
Well, I don't know if it would be like honorable.
Well, that would be probably the sentiment, but what does it literally translate to?
Well, like chiarissimo, I mean, I'm not really sure, because chiaro in the sense of clear.
That's what I assume too. So you think of like the trope of the professor that no one can understand, whereas here, sorry?
Or bright. I mean,
yeah. So in my mind, I immediately thought of think of the trope of the professor that no one can understand. They're just up at the blackboard and you have no idea what they're saying. Whereas maybe they've gotten to the level of prominence where they can actually, they're understandable and able to transmit all the lovely knowledge that they have to their students.
Yes. So bright, yes. I would also like to thank all the people in this chat, which I can't actually see anywhere except unless they've commented. But a lot of people here have really helped me along my way in this path. And I've kind of looked through here, Massimo and his daughter, especially Ilaria, and Mario and Annalisa, were really helpful for me within the Italian, academic world to, had a role in this path that I took, and I'm really grateful to them, and also grateful, to my family for everything that they've done. So.
Yeah, I should probably note also that the professors that you mentioned study also the genetics of grapes. So it's a full circle for what we were talking about today. Well, fantastic. Sara, I really appreciate your time. I know you're super busy. Thanks for delving really deep into linguistics and tying it to wine. And I think it's great. I think you're doing some great research, and look forward to reading your next, your next work.
I'm surprised you got through that.
I haven't finished it. I only got it yesterday, so I thought I'd have more time to go through it. I didn't. It takes me some time. So I'll gingerly read through it and give it back to your folks in perfect condition.
Yeah, if you want, but not necessary.
No, it's fun. It's fun. I appreciate it. Fantastico. Grazie, Sara. Have a lovely night over there. Get some sleep, get some rest, and be safe.
Thanks everyone for being here. I can't see all of you, but it means a lot to me that you're here watching.
Fantastico.
Okay.
Ciao. Oh, so great to talk to Sara. I haven't seen her in a little while, obviously, because of the difficulties of traveling. But it's great that she's continuing her research in such a strong way and doing some really interesting research. Next week, we're going to be talking to a master sommelier in a different, one of the first Latin master sommelier that is in Puerto Rico right now, but he has experience with some new projects that he's doing. He was the 12th master sommelier in the United States, and we're going to talk about languages again, but also some of the new projects he's been doing during these difficult times. He hasn't stopped creating and finding new things to do. So look forward to seeing you next week, everybody. Please be healthy and safe, and lots of warm wishes and thoughts to all our friends in Italy and US and everywhere in the Americas as well. Ci sentiamo. Ciao, ciao.